Hi, I'm Benjamin Studebaker.
And I'm David McKerracher. You're listening to Why Left?
So this is the erotic episode. It's the episode where we're talking about eros, specifically. A while back, we talked about all of these different Greek loves, Greek drives, Greek energies, and put them in a little bit of a framework. I wrote something up on Substack a while back to this effect. And today we're going to focus in on eros because Dave has eros in mind today.
Right. Eros was something that you had brought up in that sequence that included, chief among all the others, agape. And the idea is that eros, especially a culture that is so focused on personal pleasure, eros kind of gets in the way of agape. But then we were also talking about so does pragma. And eros and pragma, which is kind of like work and play or work and consumption, these two things are getting in the way of philia as well. And am I missing one? Was there another very important one? There's a self-love, right?
There's philautia, the self-love. There's storge, the love of family, community, city, and then of course agape. Yeah.
Okay, there we go. And so basically, philautia, storge, philia, agape, these all are very important, but in their commodification, they become eroticized also, maybe in a certain way.
Eroticized and pragmatized and instrumentalized for the purposes of time, the love of honor or status, which is another one that people get.
Well, I kind of want to lead off with that one. We were just saying before we started recording, I do want to talk a little bit about my motivations in a sort of socioanalytic sense for talking about this without getting into the kinds of details that the two of us find for our own reasons, perhaps, inappropriate to be sharing on the internet. And I was saying, this kind of ties back to let's bring back don't ask, don't tell, eh? Maybe we should bring that back. Maybe it's time to do a little bit more of that. And you were saying that you take this as far as maybe don't share your food pictures online.
Yeah. When I think about eros, I don't think purely about sexual interests or sexual activity. Eros is a kind of door into the other loves. It's something that everybody has to deal with. It's part of everybody's life. And you kind of go through it. Eros begins in this playing with what is me versus what's not me. So if I put something in my mouth, it becomes part of me. But when does it become part of me? Where does the separation between me and it exist? The erotic breaks down, but also seems to establish to some degree the separation of persons and the separation of objects. So to be able to develop a notion of ego and then to break that notion down and transcend it, you have to engage with the erotic. You have to engage with this inserting stuff into other stuff and then trying to figure out what does it mean that these things can be connected in some way? These things which seem separate, now they seem to go together, but they don't seem to be totally the same thing. So the erotic, I think, has to do with all sorts of bodily consumptive desires. So not just sex, but also food, drinking things. It can be tactile. It can be to do with any of the senses, which sort of blurs that separation between self and other, while also at the same time demonstrating the separation of persons. And that's what makes the erotic kind of mysterious, because it doesn't simply blur, nor does it simply separate. It does both at the same time, and depending on what you're paying attention to, you notice different aspects of it.
Right.
So it kind of opens a mystery of how might we relate to the things which seem to be other than us.
Mm.
And then this allows us to complexify and make more sophisticated those relations over time as we contemplate and think about the erotic experience.
Right.
So the erotic experience is not something to be rejected or repressed, but also it's not the point of life. It's a door into a whole vast domain.
And it's a door opened to a vast domain that becomes the predominant frame. And that when a person even just shares their food pictures, in a sort of sense, we could talk about the normalization and reification of that frame, which, engages our senses in a way that gets us thinking in terms of either eros or pragma, right? It makes me think about food. Either I like that food or I don't like that food. And if I don't like that food, I probably am also in a sort of sense thinking about the food that I do like. And now I'm thinking about food instead of things that matter in some deeper or higher sort of sense.
Yeah, and the eye becomes all identified with tastes. The eye becomes all identified with liking or disliking. And this narrows what the eye is and keeps it very much in the separation. So I'm different from other people because I like these things and I don't like these other things. These experiences I like, these other experiences I don't like. It's a very childlike way.
Hate to interrupt, but we would be remiss to not share an advertisement from our sponsors. And we're not sponsored by any corporate or state entities other than ourselves. So I'll just tell you a little bit about some of the past courses and the ongoing courses here at TU. Because if any of them sound exciting to you, well, you can access all of them by becoming a subscriber. That's right, subscribers make all of this possible. Subscribers get access to the course I taught on Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, as well as the course that I taught the first half of last year, Emmanuel Levinas's Totality and Infinity, the second half for which I will be teaching this winter. I've also taught Critical Media Theory and Critical Doxology and Timenergy with my wife, Anne Snellgrove McKerracher, who is the co-host on What's Right. Also, you would get access to the course I taught at the university, 3 semesters worth, on Intro to Critical Social Theory and Socioanalysis. But also, we've had lots of other great professors teach Introduction to Marxism by Chris Catrone, Intro to Lacan via Seminar 11 with Todd McGowan, Introduction to Ivan Illich with Brian Weeks, The Clinical Structures of Psychoanalysis and Autism with Dr. Leon Brenner, the Michael Downs Seminar, Introduction to Slavoj Žižek, Introduction to Nick Land, and Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do, all taught by Michael Downs, as well as What is Sex? There was a collab that I did with Cadell Last, Theory 101, a collab I did with Hello Gorgias. And then also, of course, there's Carl Jaspers' The Idea of the University, PMC Consciousness and Ideology. These were early, very important courses that I taught with friends at TU back in 2023. And they remain important to this day. Every one of these courses comes out of an overarching research project. There's a real driving force, mission, and agenda to the research going on at TU because we want to understand the situation for the sake of large-scale structural change focused on the good life. What does that actually mean? If you really want to go deep, obviously, these courses are something you could spend the better part of a year binging while at work. Ongoing courses that come out on a monthly basis are the Fundamental Problems and Core Concepts at TU with yours truly, also my seminar, Philosophy of Nature with Nina Power, the Benjamin Studebaker seminar, as well as his course, The 12 Political Theorists. We've got some really exciting stuff coming down the line. The only way to make this all possible and really deepen your knowledge and familiarity with all of these different things is to become a subscriber today at http://theoryunderground.com/subscribe.
Like, it's a very childlike way of thinking. Children think this way all the time. And it's perfectly normal for children to think this way because children are still playing around with that sense of I. They're trying to establish it so that they can overcome it. They have to first establish it to then be able to overcome it. So there has to be a period of establishing it. But this is something that's supposed to occur when you're very young. It's not something that is to be retained into adulthood. In adulthood, you're supposed to overcome yourself. You're supposed to get past this kind of identification with the object of erotic desire.
Right.
So why would you be principally defined by what foods you eat? Lots of little kids define themselves very strongly with, I'm a picky eater, I eat this, I don't eat that. But why would an adult be defined principally in terms of what they put in their mouth? Why would an adult be defined principally in terms of who or what they want to have sexual relations with? It's a strange thing, but we have seen this in recent years, this tendency to try to group people up on the basis of what it is that they like to look at, taste, feel, hear, music. This is very common with adolescents to move it to music and the erotic of the sound. Any sense organ can be the basis for doing this kind of thing. It's not simply or merely a sexual thing. And there's a kind of tendency to hyper focus on the sexual element, in part because the tendency in the last 50, 60 years or so in Christian thought has been to really emphasize the family and the sexual relation as part of trying to defend some notion of family. So the sexual side of the erotic has been kind of separated out and treated as very different, very distinct from the rest. But I think that that's an overemphasis made in response to certain contingent social and historical situations, not something fundamental. Violence also has an erotic side to it because violence also plays with this question of what's me, what's not me. And the destructive impulse, which children have all the time, is another part of this thinking about how should I relate to that which seems to be other. In the act of violence, you insert into something. So there's a sense in which you liquidate the separation in the act of attacking the thing that you seem to think that you can destroy.
Right. Now, on this connection, I said I'll do this little socioanalytic thing. But I think what we've now established here is sort of this bedrock of shared assumptions. On that basis, then I'll just say, bringing it back to Time, which is, for those new to this whole conversation, recognition, basically, right? We're basically talking about pride, glory, honor, prestige would count. And so in that sense, Pierre Bourdieu's work is really a deep analysis of the ways that Time structures fields that are not obviously economic, and that there's actually a sort of economy of Time, especially for the PMC. Right? That is basically an oversimplification of what Bourdieu is up to. And of course, insofar as you've never thought about that, or you haven't thought about how those that the force fields or the fields of the forces of these fields have a sort of gravity on you and your colleagues, it's important. But then, of course, even if you're not in academia and you're someone online who is in some way reacting to academia or inspired by academia, we're all in some way adjacent to it. This becomes a very important part of figuring out what's going on with the world today, especially activism, right? And so socioanalysis then, as something that was pioneered by Bourdieu, which is taking psychoanalysis and bringing it to this sort of field analysis that I'm describing, asks us to be a little reflexive and think about how do the forces of these fields, their gravity, so to speak, shape us and our relations with others, and the relations of production and therefore the reproduction of those relations of production. And so doing a little bit of that on my own, I just said I'm gonna take this don't ask, don't tell. I'm not gonna embellish too much. But at the same time, I think I can be vague enough and just say, as a young man, I was very shaped by this sort of, what do we call it, heterosexual culture. And, in the same way that it's weird to identify primarily as a homosexual, like that's your whole identity, it's weirder to identify as a heterosexual and have that be your whole identity. It makes more sense for a homosexual because it's been turned into such a thing and it's rewarded.
It's been repressed.
It's been repressed. And so it's rewarded by one side of the political establishment, and it's punished by the other side, right? And so that makes more sense. The heterosexual thing is kind of weird, but of course, any guy who thinks that his value comes from getting laid, and we'll say a heterosexual guy, that is a heterosexual thing. That is to say that your core identity is being made sense of by that, right? And so that is a way. But if your sense of value, of esteem, of place in the world, of if you're cool, etc., comes from your dating market value, or even hookup market value, if you're thinking in those terms, this is a combination of time, eros, and pragma, right? That is 100% what it is, and it obviously shuts you off to agape, philia, and storge. Is it philatia? Not Philatia. Philatia.
Yeah, Philatia. Yeah.
Philatia. It looks like Philatia, which makes you think of fellatio. That's funny.
Gets you caught in different kinds of things.
Yeah.
And this doesn't have to be, purely in terms of sexuality. When I was a kid in elementary school, I was very much a basketball kid. And I thought of myself as a kid who likes basketball, and I identified with the other basketball kids, and then against the football kids, the kids who liked football better.
Oh, yeah.
And then I had a friend who was a basketball kid, but decided that he wanted to play football. And it was as if he had betrayed our religion or something.
Oh, no.
It was a huge problem that he decided to play a different game, because when I was a kid, this is what we did. We played basketball at recess and not football like those football kids. This kind of stuff, which people do with sexuality, or they do with their diet, or they do with all kinds of things. It's very, very, very childlike.
Mm-hmm.
But part of what's going on is a normalization of childlike behavior at stages of life where there's good reason for people to have superseded that.
Right. No, in that sense, I would say it stunted my growth in a variety of ways, right? Like there was this sort of extended adolescence because of, and I can just like retroactively look back and be like, yeah, that was the culture that I was in, and it seemed like the only alternative to marrying young. Like the only alternative to marrying young, saving it for marriage, having kids as soon as possible. Like the only alternative was this sort of liberal consumer individualist approach where your dating and or hookup market value was a very important thing, if not the most important thing. And so with that said, and that's all the details I really want to go into on it. I'm just saying, I think with like a lot of guys, it was a big deal for me. The same is true, and maybe to a more extreme sense, for people who are incels. These people are defining themselves by their inability to have any hookup or dating market value. So their life is still defined by time, eros, and pragma. They're just defining themselves as losers there. And I was trying to define myself as a winner there. If my horizon of possibilities was such that I was like, I can win at this game and I'm gonna, you know what I mean? Like I had like that sort of mentality. Whereas the incel's like, I can't win at this game. My jawline is so bad. My chin, it's so recessed. There's no way a woman could ever love me, you know? And you can be sympathetic or you can make fun of it. But the point is that the incel versus the what's the opposite of the it's I don't want to say Chad. I want to maybe, but whatever, hot boy. The difference
Fuckboy would be a
the
term that you would often
fuck boy.
hear women use to describe that kind of person.
100%. So the fuckboy incel spectrum is all framed by the exact same door. It's all the exact same door.
Yeah, and this focus on Time, the honor status, reputational thing, here you're focusing on how you appear to somebody else. So instead of the experience of the insertion of the combination, what you move to is imagining how you look, how you seem to somebody else, and becoming fixated on this appearance in the mind of the other that you can't straightforwardly have. You can't reach into someone's mind and know exactly what they think of you. And if you ask them, what do you think of me? And they say something to you, you can never be sure if they're telling the truth. So there's a mystery to this. And teenagers become very, very captivated by this. What does somebody else think of me? Even if I ask them, and even if I think they're telling me the truth, I can't be sure. And in a lot of teen movies, teen literature, a lot of them turn on somebody that you thought you were cool, didn't think you were cool the whole time, and actually was just planning to bully you. The whole time that they acted like they thought you were cool, they were actually conspiring with others in the community to bully you. Very recurrent trope in teen fiction, because that's the obsession at that stage. But just like with EROS, a lot of people retain this obsession with how do I appear to the other, well past the point at which that should be overcome.
Yeah.
Because you have to get to the stage of overcoming yourself. So you have to get to the point at which you're able to say, what matters in life is not simply me, but is something larger than me. But to do that, you have to make peace with the you. So it's not simply an act of repression or negation. You don't get there by refusing EROS or refusing Time. You get there by making peace with the body that you have and the desires that arise from the sense of separation that you have. You find ways to moderate these things and you deal with them. So you don't make a life where you never eat anything or you never have sex with anybody or you never do any of these things, nor do you make a life where you never worry about what other people are thinking and whether other people approve or don't approve of the way you're treating them. No, what you do is you moderate your concern for these things. You structure your life in such a way that you get enough to eat, but not too much, that you have enough people giving you recognition and making you feel like you matter, but not to the point at which this is the dominant theme in your life. And then once you satisfy these things to a moderate degree, then this makes it possible to not be caught up in them or preoccupied by them. And in this way, they create further possibilities. If you attempt to refuse them, if you attempt to repress them, they just come back and dominate your life even more. So if you respond to this by trying to be really hardcore ascetic, with very few exceptions, there are some very committed ascetics. Most people who attempt to do that will just find that it comes back and they're even more dominated by it. They're just thinking all the time about how they have to refuse the thing. And if you're thinking all the time about not doing what you want to do on the erotic level or on the level of Time, that's the same as spending all of your time thinking about how you do want to do those things, because you're still caught up in the I and whether the I wants or the I doesn't want or the I doesn't want to want or wants to want. This is all still egocentric. So at some stage, you have to get to the point where you make peace with yourself. And philautia is a kind of peace with yourself, a self-love which allows you to not be mad at yourself because you have desires, but also not to be run by those desires all the time. So it involves a kind of dialectical relation with the body. And once this is achieved, you then cease to be preoccupied with the self. in the way that you were before. And suddenly it becomes possible to put yourself in service to things outside of you that are larger than you. And then these things can have a disciplining effect on you. And over time, bring out all kinds of positive qualities in you that you could never have imagined that you could have when you were caught up in yourself. And this is the sense in which we can talk about unreconstructed people versus reconstructed people. People who have reached a certain point in the project of self overcoming versus people who have not done that. Wise people versus foolish people. There is a meaningful difference. And it comes from, have you gotten to a stage where you're able to cultivate these other qualities that are really about enabling you to serve and devote yourself to others and to causes? Or are you still embedded in who am I, what am I? And sometimes I will put it this way. I'll go, oh, this is more who am I, what am I stuff. You know, the way that you know that a story is adolescent is that it's kind of top level of thinking is identity based. It's who am I, what am I? Not what should I do? How should I live? What's worth serving? Who's worth serving? What's worthy, a worthy goal, a worthy aim for a person? No, still caught up in the who am I, what am I?
As opposed to the who, why, and what am I doing?
Yeah, what is this for? Is it just for the gratification of EROS and for trying to have a reputation and for making a bunch of money or something? Yeah, this is people who think that this is what life is about are just operating from a very regressed position.
Yeah.
Very regressed position. But this is how I would make the cut between young adult or teen or kid content and adult content. And if you have something that's made for kids but points beyond the young adult experience, that gestures at something beyond that for children, then that can have great mystery for kids, even if they're not able to initially access those themes or those qualities. And a lot of children's literature used to attempt in some way to point beyond the stuff that children and teens are ordinarily drawn to and to invite them to maybe think that there might be something beyond them that they could be interested in. But in more recent years, this has become less common as more and more people have forgotten that there is anything else that life could be about, apart from simply accepting the desires of other people.
Right.
Pursuing whatever it is that you happen to want, not questioning what you want or what other people want.
Well, on the internet,
somebody can be in front of you and have desires that are clearly regressed in character, and you can say, this is an immature person, and it is possible to be able to make those distinctions and make that judgment. That doesn't mean that you should get caught up in feeling superior, because if you do that, then that's pride.
You're right back
and
in
you're
it.
caught up
You're right
in
back
timid.
in it. You're right back in it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think part of this, I just was talking about this in part 2 of Being in the World, which will be uploaded this week. For one of the things Heidegger does that is a significant break from Kierkegaard and Nietzsche is that authenticity is not like this thing where it's like a switch and now you're a different person. It's like it is this constant work in progress, and you're always backsliding. Like the gravitational pull of the world is to take easy ways out, to take the paths that have already been paved, to take generic possibilities as opposed to those ones that are more difficult and that actually require a sort of deliberate sacrifice, the kind that requires a risk, right? And so risk aversion would be a big part of that. I was talking about how this should help you be more empathetic and compassionate as opposed to less, because the more existentialist kind of authenticity that Heidegger is critiquing which Adorno critiques as well in the jargon of authenticity. He blames Heidegger for its popularity, but in reality, what he's arguing against is this kind that Heidegger was arguing against, and I go into that in my lecture course on Being in Time. But the they would both get a laugh out of what Adorno opens that work with, which is making fun of this group that was meeting in Chicago. The name of the group was The Authentic Ones, and it's just like Adorno was cringing at the idea and making fun of it at the beginning of his book. But the point is like we do feel this need to stop being inauthentic at some point. And I like to talk about how like that's probably between the ages of 12 and 35. Somewhere in that range, you realize that you've been making decisions without really making decisions, right? You've not really been thinking. You've been you've been given false choices, and that you've been in a sort of passive sort of state, and that choosing to become more active and deliberate is something that anybody going into philosophy or theory is probably aware of, right? You're aware that people use terms in an ambiguous way, and you're starting to realize, oh, I love to have deeper conversations, but for some reason those don't really happen, right? Like people seem to want to talk about truth and beauty and justice, but then what they do is they exchange these sort of predictable yet ambiguous scripts. And they're ambiguous in the sense that if I try to say, well, let's drill down into that, people get irritable, or they don't have the patience to really tarry with going deeper into these concepts. That impatience is the sign that you are kind of down there in Plato's cave, and you are striving for something better, something higher, right? And the thing is we can get stuck in wanting out of the cave, and then because we want out of the cave and we're aware that people are interpreting shadows on the wall, celebrate the fact that they are, celebrate the fact that we are aware that they are, and that we're at least enlightened enough to know that those are shadows. But the actual process of getting out of the cycle of falling, or which you're never completely out of, but this one between ambiguity, non-committal curiosity, and idle chatter, like the process of saying, no, I'm gonna take these things down to the root. I'm actually going to go read Hobbes's The Leviathan and the Behemoth. I'm going to go read these. I'm going to actually do it myself. I'm going to stop just listening to other people interpret these things 5 times removed from the sources, right? That sort of striving is something that most people, Benjamin, maybe you started at the age of 7 or something, but most people start, between the ages of 12 or 35,
Well, this is a good point. Depending on how you are brought up as a child, you reach different levels of development at different points. Some people grow up in a household that represses the development of their ego so that they don't even get to the stage of being able to potentially overcome themselves until much later in life, if at all. Because, of course, it becomes harder to think in a plastic way past a certain age. You get stuck in particular rooted ways of thinking. So for many people, if they're raised in an environment where they never get any love or recognition, they're never treated as a person who matters, what is on their mind is never something that the people around them are concerned about. If you're in an environment where you are underfed, where you're not taken care of, your basic sensory needs are not met, you're uncomfortable a lot, you feel that you suffer from scarcity all the time, there is a tendency to become preoccupied as a consequence of that kind of upbringing with the thing that you were denied, whether it's something erotic or sensory, or something to do with recognition. Sometimes these things are combined and put together, so the desire for recognition is in some way inserted into the sexual desire, and so the erotic becomes caught up with the time in a way that's very hard to disentangle or separate. We talk about this all the time in terms of mommy issues, daddy issues. Somebody wasn't recognized by a parent, didn't reach a stage of sufficient recognition, and therefore is caught in trying to somehow find that or replicate that in a different kind of relationship, which isn't actually for that purpose and isn't optimized insofar as it is treated as for that purpose. This kind of stuff happens all the time. When you meet somebody who is a child and who is behaving in a childlike way, what kind of person are you if you mock that child or bully that child or treat that child badly? One of the things that we know when we see somebody who's 4 years old who is behaving like a child is that if we are bullies to 4-year-olds, that doesn't tend to help 4-year-olds go through the necessary process of development. We tend to think pedagogically when we deal with 4-year-olds. We go, what kind of intervention is necessary to help this person make the next step? And this involves making a judgment about where they are in a process of development, and therefore what kind of intervention is appropriate for them. And if you misjudge where they are in the process of development, then you make an inappropriate intervention that comes too early or it comes too late. And it's difficult, it's tricky to get this right, because not only do you have to judge whether they have or don't have certain capacities, you have to figure out what the right intervention is. Iamblichus, the Platonist, calls this theurgic virtue, the virtue of being able to decide what kind of experience somebody else needs to move them up a character ladder, a ladder of virtues, help them access higher kinds of drives or points of view. This is something that is very difficult to do. And it requires a real commitment when you meet someone who seems to be caught in some childlike or adolescent stage to seriously think about what can you do, if anything, to help. And at minimum, if you recognize that you might not be in position to help, which often we're not, often we don't know enough about a person to help them. We don't know enough about why they are the way they are. We don't have that stuff. And it's not simply the case, by the way, that simply getting somebody's backstory, having somebody tell you their sob story about how they had a bad childhood, that will give you the answer or make it obvious to you what to do. A lot of the time, that just gives you a false confidence that you know enough to act, and then you make another mistake. So a lot of the time when we meet somebody who is for some reason or other regressed, we have to take a step back from that person and be very careful about how we interact or how we engage, because it takes a lot of wisdom, more wisdom than it takes to overcome yourself, to help somebody else do it. And we need the humility in these moments not to think that we know what the obvious response is. And the tendency today is for people to want to dunk all the time, especially because a lot of people think they've overcome themselves but haven't. If they've managed to handle EROS, then they get proud of it. Then they stay in the pride, stay in the time about having figured out how to handle EROS. And then they never get outside of that. The fact that they've handled EROS becomes their excuse to stay in time and to stay in the I and to not move on. And a lot of these people, their impulse is to want to dunk on anybody who seems to be caught in any erotic mode. And this is, I think, something that a lot of people on the right have been caught up in over the years. They figure out how to moderate, or at least to appear to others to have moderated, certain desires. And then they use this as a platform from which to dunk on people who don't seem to have done that. And sometimes you discover that they never actually succeeded in moderating those erotic desires, that they repress them for the purposes of gratifying the time, and that in practice, those desires are still playing a large role in their life. They've just managed to keep it hidden from other people or keep it behind scenes. Now, why would that be? Their main focus is on how they appear to others. They don't care about what's true. They care about seeming to have overcome these things. That truth is not actually important. That's one of the ways you could tell the difference between somebody who's caught up in time and somebody who has a more robust commitment to moderation on the basis of devotion to some real meaningful cause. But of course, then you'll have the liberal who will say, well, no one ever overcomes EROS at all. No one ever overcomes time at all. The people who claim to do it are all hypocrites. And they just deny the possibility of in any way developing virtues or moderating any of these tendencies. So these are
Like
the two
immediately.
kind of characteristic culture war modes: the liberal who says nobody can do this and accuses of hypocrisy, and the conservative who says I've done it, but pridefully without having actually done it.
Right. Yeah. And the immediate example that comes to mind would be um, the other day I saw this liberal or leftist type of person giving some kind of a speech in some kind of a political space, whether it was a town hall or, some Senate chamber. I don't know. I just saw this guy giving this speech out of context where he was tearing them a new one, and speaking truth to power. People were all rethreading it. Is that what you say? Rethread? Because I think I saw it on Instagram, but then it was shared through threads. Anyway, and one of the things that he does is he's like talking about how you guys don't care about children, you guys don't care about women, you guys don't care about life. What you guys care about is, and he's going into all this stuff, and of course, under the mask is bigotry and hypocrisy, and especially fear, right? And one of the things he goes to is how, and this is a common thing to hear from Democrats, which is that whenever the Republicans get together in mass, the grinder numbers go up, right? The gay app, the meetup, the gay meetup app, its numbers boom wherever the RNC occurs, right? For the whole time that it's happening, and of course everyone's supposing that that's because you have all these Republicans who are like repressed, or they've repressed their homosexual tendencies, and that's why they hate gay stuff so much. And so when they all get together, obviously there's going to be a higher number of them that are, hey, I'm in town, I'm out of the area, I'm away from the wife and my million children. So, and that's the idea. And I think in some cases, of course, that's going to be true. So anytime you find a bunch of conservatives, this is going to be a thing. And I want to say something about Mars Hill, but no, you go.
As you were talking, I also thought about how we could flip it. So we had said, the accusation of hypocrisy comes from the liberal and is directed at the conservative, and the accusation of pride comes from, these being kind of the quintessential vices. But of course, it goes the other way around. So, for instance, a lot of liberals think that they've substituted for traditional erotic vices, the vices of racism and sexism and homophobia, but are caught up in time, are caught up in appearing to have overcome those things. And then in practice, behind scenes, you'll often find that they have engaged in behavior which seems very overtly racist or sexist or what have you. That's also something which often happens among liberals or progressives who are caught up in time. And conversely, you'll then see people on the right accuse them of hypocrisy with regard to these categories. So it's something that can go in many different directions. I don't want to suggest that the right and the left exclusively have particular vices or particular orientations with respect to this. I mean, really, to just give the example of how often time becomes an excuse to only seem to have overcome other vices.
Right. Well, on this conservatives repressing EROS thing, I wanted to touch on a recent scandal that I found totally fascinating. There's this amazing public philosophy meetup group in Nampa, Idaho, led by our friend Elton L.K. of the Working Class Intelligentsia. And I believe it was there that some of the post-evangelical members were talking about Pastor Mark Driscoll. Did you ever hear about this guy with the Mars Hill Church in Seattle?
I don't think so.
Okay, so this became a mega church with a lot of satellites, sort of a franchise. It was very big. And Mark Driscoll, charismatic guy, evangelical. And turns out, total sex pest, and lots of women were really not happy about him. And so, kind of a Me Too situation. And I remember being, kind of fascinated at the time looking into it, because it kind of goes along with a bunch of other stories like that I've encountered over the years. And so I actually looked into the book that those members of the philosophy meetup group had been talking about. I listened to it one day while working. And so I know a little bit about this guy's philosophy, and his philosophy might even be to blame. It's interesting. So basically, I think sometimes like really big sort of personal failings like this guy can come from categorical or conceptual error. Now, of course, he could just be a bad guy, and I don't want to exclude the possibility that he's a bad guy. But basically, what he professed is the idea that sex is good. Sex is good. It's good within the context of the marriage. It's good for the sake of reproduction. But if a man feels the need to do it, right, his wife needs to be ready and willing. And if she's not, the man straying is going to come back. Ultimately, the primary responsibility is going to come back on her, which is insane. I understand that's insane. But if you believe something like, my sexuality, being heterosexual, it's blessed. It's a good thing. It's inherently a good thing within the safe confines of a marriage. But of course, the only way that's going to work is if, my wife is obedient and truly following me and she's always kind of down. Of course, it's going to lead to this kind of crazy contradiction because that's not how people work. And what it is doing is it's taking eros and putting it into the center of the marriage in a way that it becomes the center of the liberal identity that is post-marriage, in this sort of extreme, either polyamorous or just whatever, non-committal, no strings attached kind of approach. Both are being framed by the idea that my eros is noble, actually. It's actually precious and it's the most important thing. Somehow it's just so good.
Yeah, if you become too affirmative or too negative about eros or time, you run into trouble. The trick is to recognize we are people. We do have separate bodies. We will sometimes, unless we are extraordinarily spiritually trained, get caught in embodiment, and we do have certain physical needs as a consequence of that. That is something that has to be dealt with. And in a good marriage, your partner helps you manage the desires that come from embodiment. And one of the intimate things about a relationship is that someone is invited to participate in and help you with the management. So, but this doesn't just mean that somebody has sex with you. It also might mean that somebody prepares food for you. It might mean that somebody helps you meet other physical needs that you have in your day-to-day life. They're invited into helping you meet the needs of the body. And then as a team, you help each other meet these needs. You help each other moderate them and keep them reasonable. And then as a consequence of this teamwork, you're both more able than you would be alone outside of that cooperative framework to pursue other more valuable goals and projects. The family being the most obvious one for two people in a marriage, but certainly not the only one that people can potentially pursue. And of course, marriage is just one of the many possible cooperative frameworks that people can be in, associations, social groups, political entities. There's all sorts of different kinds of structures in which human beings cooperate with each other to manage the body so that we can do things which go beyond merely that management.
Yeah. So Pastor Mark Driscoll, I think he actually represents a very dangerous tendency for those who react against Eros-centric, permissive liberalism. If you have a kind of liberalism that is still Eros-centric but more conservative in this sort of pseudo-traditionalist approach that doesn't understand anything about the virtues and how those have to be balanced off against one another, then his path, I think, is one that I just wouldn't be surprised when I find out that someone who is living that lifestyle, they go down it. Not to say everyone does, but I'm just saying when people, and I'll use people who I've heard talking about him, talk about him, the fact is a lot of the time they're post-evangelical progressives. A lot of times when people have been hurt by the church, a church, they will go this post-evangelical progressive direction. And then, of course, the real problem with the evangelicals is that they weren't inclusive enough towards gay people. And then, of course, they end up becoming uber inclusive, and then they're all about pride. And the thing, it just becomes another version of EROS centrism. And so it's just like the two sides eating at each other and reacting to legitimate excesses and deviancies both end up supercharging this door frame of pragma, eros, time, and ultimately it's all part of capital and its reproduction. So
if you're in a bad community that doesn't work, then all of the flaws of that community are in the way in which you were brought up. And therefore, simply negating that community or doing the opposite, that's a very blind kind of way of trying to deal with that problem. It's necessary to recognize that the community that you were in did not properly shape you. But then the aim should be to get the things that you didn't get the stages of progression that you didn't get through that community, rather than assuming that you can just flip the normative claims or flip the emphasis and that will get you somewhere. It's a very tricky thing. The other thing people often do is they start pragmatizing everything in relationships. They start keeping score, or they start treating sex like something you trade with your spouse or partner for other things, or particular sexual acts are exchanged for other favors, treating sex as a favor thing.
This is a very like 1990s sitcom dynamic. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's one of the worst things that you see, because it turns the relationship, which is meant to lead you to the idea of devotion to another person, and then to the concept of family, and then to further abstractions. It turns that into a way of keeping you in a commercial dynamic, and it turns your relationship into another iteration of work. Horrible stuff. And then you start talking about the emotional labor and the fairness with regard to household chores.
Yes. Yeah.
This is not the way to think about this stuff. Of course, if somebody's feeling exploited within the dynamic of the relationship, if the bodily needs of somebody are being so thoroughly neglected that they're compelled to view the relationship in pragmatic terms, that's a sign of something deeply wrong that needs to be dealt with and talked through and worked on. But that's not to say that the solution is to simply succumb to treating it in a pragmatic way. If both people in the relationship have to adopt a pragmatic attitude to it for it to work, it's not a real functioning relationship. It's just a fake ersatz version of that.
We'll be right back right after this. TU is building a studio. I have officially cleared ground. I've been working on it for the last several months on and off, but am, as of this last week, beginning to get a lot more traction on the project because more money has come in. So thank you so much for those who have already contributed via donations for the TU studio. It's going to happen no matter what, but the question is when. If you want to help speed up the process, make things smoother sailing, and help me keep creating the kinds of content that you love, and even better, the kinds of content that is to come. There's a whole new era getting rolled out. If you want to help make it possible and usher it in smoother and faster, the best way to do that is to make a donation via the Zelle link up on the screen here. You see that QR code? Use that QR code. Once you have an account, that QR code should take you to where you can make the bank transfer with zero charge, which is really sweet, huh? Yeah, we love that. That's why we're using Zelle. Thank you so much for helping make this possible. And we're back. So we got to close out in a minute. I just want to kind of I wanted to say, maybe in your closing thoughts here, Benjamin, you could say something about the relationship between lust and eros, since they're not the same thing. And I just want to say in my own closing that all of this makes me really want to go much deeper into classical virtues. I know I can do that with Confucius. I know I can do that with Aristotle. I can do that with Plato. I can do that with Aquinas. I can do that with a bunch of other amazing thinkers. But also here we are in the 21st century in the aftermath of a lot of the crazy changes that have devastated that old world, right? There's all kinds of changes in conditions, material conditions. A global order that centers pragma and eros, so to speak. Like that is itself a change. But also, we're in the wake of the masters of suspicion and any kind of traditional institution like the church losing its place, its role. And so there's always this question of, well, does that mean you go back to the church, bring back the church, right? Is the trajectory that McKerracher takes, for instance, in After Virtue, is that the direction? Because it starts as a big defense of Aristotle, and then eventually where he ends up is Catholicism. When I think of great critics of liberalism like Patrick J. Denis, he's a Catholic. And so there is this approach that is against this liberal individualism, this eros, this pragma, that is, its approach is to be more traditional, and it usually is Catholic, at least in the United States. So I think of it, and I do appreciate these authors immensely. But then I also think about authors who are more philosophical and theoretically based. I think of ones who are critiquing neo-Kantianism, or who are wrestling with a philosophy of science, who are wrestling with the masters of suspicion, like especially Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx. And so Heidegger's obviously a big one, but Heidegger doesn't put the virtues front and center, right? He doesn't do this. Well, who does? And I've been thinking a lot about Max Scheler, and I kind of want to just leave off on saying that Max Scheler is a contemporary of Heidegger who's thinking very deeply about, Nietzsche and everything he brings to the table, but then is still saying, no, I think even from a basic phenomenological standpoint, we can show the superiority of some of these classical discoveries, in particular, the virtues. And so if anybody's looking to go much deeper into this kind of stuff that is not relativistic or absolutist in the typical American way, and that isn't just doing some religious thing, but is actually trying to do a very critical philosophy on the terms of a critical philosophy, a modern one. Well, I'm thinking a lot about Scheler, and I was just listening to After Virtue today, and I'm getting a lot out of it and realizing how much it really has impacted me from when I initially listened to it, I think a few years ago. So yeah, this has been great, Benjamin.
Yeah, definitely. Those 7 deadly sins, they're not necessarily to be ranked. Typically, if they are ranked, pride tends to be the one that is singled out as the worst one, because it's the one that you can still be caught in even when you think you've mastered the rest. And indeed, it's in thinking that you've mastered the rest and in giving yourself a little bit too much credit that you land in pride. So I think a lot of the time in our culture, lust tends to be exoticized or overemphasized, which is still a consequence of the repression, the repressive way of handling it that prevailed in recent years, particularly in certain kinds of churches. Part of overcoming that repression is also to overcome the various one-sided partial ways of overcoming it. So we don't simply champion lust in response to its having been repressed. We don't make your lust a point of pride. We don't treat it as the core source of identity, although some people might have to pass through a period of doing that en route to figuring things out. We don't forget about the other things that people get caught up in. Just because it's not sexual doesn't mean it's not a problem. People who are absorbed with the eating and absorbed with the sleeping and absorbed with the acquisition of instrumental means, all-purpose instrumental means. These people are also mistaking something for the good in itself, which is not actually that thing. They're still caught too much in the ego and in them and what they can get and in winning games as a player. You know, life is not about playing. Life is not about being the player. If you play video games for long enough, you start to realize the game is not about the character that you're playing as. What makes the game interesting is not the character that you're playing as. And some video games have managed to get people to care about things in the world of the game that are not the player character. And those games, I think, have some artistic possibility in them. You know, they point a little bit beyond the player. But a lot of other games don't really, and just focus on numbers that the player can get. All of this stuff, all of it is part of this. And I think when the word eros is used, there's a tendency to think just about sex, just about lust, and to ignore all of the rest of it. But if you use the sexual desire as an analogy for thinking about all of the other things in life, all of a sudden, all sorts of mistakes become very evident. But of course, you could never completely get rid of eating food. You could never completely get rid of sleeping. You can't completely get rid of any of the things which are the objects of these virtues, at least not while you remain within the corporeal form of the human body. So also take the analogy the other way and adopt a more moderate, reasonable attitude towards sex. Don't make it the focal point of your life, the source of identity, the point of pride, who you are. Regardless, heterosexual, homosexual, any kind of sexual, the over-invention of terms to do with the sexual is itself symptomatic of this. It doesn't really matter very much. And you, over the course of your life, will like different things. When you're a kid, you don't like the taste of coffee. Then you get to a point where you do like coffee. What would this be an identity crisis? I wasn't a coffee drinker and now I am. Who am I? What am I? This is stupid and pointless. And it's stupid and pointless when people do it with sex, just as much as with anything else.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to get caught up in being frustrated with ambiguous, non-committally curious, idle chatter, and especially the kind that frames things in the ways that we're talking about here, and because it is stupid. And then, of course, the issue is that we can then give into impatience, and then we can also give into pride because we're getting frustrated with the people around the dinner table who are enjoying the shadows on the wall, so to speak. And so I wanted to leave. That's why I wanted to leave off with virtue and just say, like, for every one of those 7 deadly sins, there's a corresponding virtue, and it's a virtue regardless of your religious orientation. And that's something I want to come back to. So I'd like to hopefully soon do an episode kind of dedicated to the virtues, and we could do a sort of history philosophy kind of approach to virtue, because focusing on what sucks, on those vices or on those sins, is itself, as you pointed out, a trap. And so what do? Well, remember that you fall short of all these other virtues every day, and that if we're remembering the golden mean,
not just that,
the direction that you need to strive.
Something other than you. Get past the you. Stop trying to be so wonderful all the time. Focus on what it is that you're devoted to. Think about what's worthy of devotion. Think about the world outside of the you. When you get to that point where you can think about out there what's worth committing a life to, then you're not so caught up in, am I good? Am I better than other people? Am I good enough? Make peace with the you. You're going to have your flaws. You're going to have the things that you wrestle with, struggle with. They'll be recurrent. They won't ever totally go away. It's okay. It's okay. Unless you're going crazy and trying to be a monk, it's okay to have some weaknesses, some areas that you struggle with. The main thing is to get past the focus on the you and get to a stage where you're able to go outside and beyond that and put all of this energy to something that's really worthwhile. And to do that, you have to accept yourself. So to get beyond the virtues and vices discussion and into the, well, what should we be doing? Then we start getting into the social, into the political, into what actually is to be done. Now, at that stage, you're ready for that. But if you try to go into the social and the political when you're still caught up in me, then your social and political commitments become ways of proving you're better than other people or you're a good person. They become completely divorced from their real purpose. They cease to be devotional pursuits and instead just become further ways of gratifying the self. So you've got to get past the preoccupation with how good a person you are.
And this is where I was just taking it.
You got to get past.
I was just taking it to say that part of what I get from the idea of the golden mean as well is that you can't know, when it comes to this comparison with other people, you can't know what a person's interior life and struggles are like. And so you don't know what it is that they're countering in terms of their own nature, their tendencies, right? So, if what brashness for one person might actually be that they are actively trying to counter their predisposition towards cowardice. And so, they're erring on the opposite side, right? But you don't know. And if you did, maybe because you know them very well, the fact is what they're going through at that moment, there's a bunch of other different things that they're dealing with as well. And so you can't know about these things. And so, but yes, if we zoom out, what we're talking about is a habitus that can come beyond CBT and these personal habit formations, a habitus that comes from serving something bigger, better, outside you. That's what we want to get to. So, yeah. Thanks, Benjamin. Subscribers get access to all past courses at Theory Underground, as well as ongoing courses taught by David McKerracher, Benjamin Studebaker, and Nina Power. Subscribers also get access to monthly research seminars, and the higher tiers of involvement unlock discussions and one-on-one small group tutelage. So if you're like me and you're never a huge bookish kind of person, but somewhere along the way you got really into listening to educational materials, if you got really into listening to podcasts and then books at work, if you love going deep into ideas, but you're just not a traditional bookish kind of person, well, this is where the alliance between people like us and people who are more bookish and specialized are able to meet to work through these things and do so in defense of the human, in defense of our dignity, in defense of our common humanity and our intellectual integrity. This is not a place where we're going to kick you out because you're pro-life or pro-choice, or where you are an atheist or a agnostic or a Christian. But it is a place where you're expected to love one another regardless of such things, and to show up for people in your actual IRL real life communities regardless of such things. And if that is exciting for you, and if you're excited to learn about what this approach, this method, this school of thought has to offer, then I'm excited to meet you. Subscribe today.